Welcome to episode 100 of Harmonious World. I was delighted to be able to visit Malcolm Singer in person and record this interview in his beautiful studio. Malcolm is a well-known and well-respected composer, conductor and educator, and we were introduced by the rather marvellous Michael Shapiro, who I've interviewed twice for Harmonious World and who I met in person in Milan in October. I hope you enjoy listening to my in real life conversation with Malcolm Singer. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Absolute pleasure.
I'm interested in your composing, your conducting, your education especially. You seem to be a very generous musician in terms of sharing your expertise.
Well, I think possibly, yes, but also I find I feed off that as well. I'm not the kind of composer who just wants to sit in a garret all the time. I want to engage with musicians, and really I just get up every morning and make music. That's what I do, and sometimes it's composing, sometimes it's conducting, sometimes it's working with younger people.
Tell me about your musical, because you went to Cambridge, didn't you? But
yes, before that, well, I was born in a hospital next to Lord's Cricket Ground at St John's Wood, and my mother was a piano teacher. My father was not musical at all, not involved in music. He was a businessman. So I heard music in the household from the earliest age. And when I was about 6, I suppose, I turned around to my mother and said, "Why aren't you teaching me the piano?" And the reason was really because she taught my older sister, and mothers and daughters don't necessarily get on very well with teaching like that, so that she thought it was best not to do it with me, but I insisted, and I started the piano. And then my grandmother said, "What do you want for your 8th birthday?" And I said, "A violin." And on my 8th birthday, a Harrods van drew up with one of those little Chinese tiny violins, so I started the violin. And then when I was 10, I got a scholarship to the Royal Academy of Music on their Saturday morning scheme, junior exhibitioner, because again my mother still felt it was best for not for her to be teaching me, for someone else. And I spent every Saturday until I was 18 at the Royal Academy, which was terribly exciting and inspiring, mainly doing piano as my first study, but doing violin and playing in orchestra, singing in choirs and music theory and all the rest of it. So that was mostly where I got my music education. And I suppose when I was about 14, when I was 3, I knew I wanted to be a conductor. That was kind of what I wanted to do. And then when I was about 14, I discovered that composing was actually probably more interesting and more rewarding. But I do both, and I like doing both. And having been involved in a music college through those teenage years, I thought, well, I ought to go to university. And also in those days, the music colleges offered diplomas rather than degrees. So I, for no very good reason, applied to Cambridge and got in and read music at Cambridge. And I spent my summers on music courses. So I was doing a conducting course in Cimier in Nice in the first summer, and the second and third summers I went to Siena. And in 1973 I met Franco Donatoni, and I was composing, and I was having lessons in London with Richard Stoker, who was a pupil of Lennox Berkeley's. So I was already composing a bit, but Franco Donatoni acted as a real catalyst. And over that July and August, the whole 2 months I spent there, he turned me into the composer I am really. It was an extraordinary summer. And the last week of that summer, Ligeti came to talk about his music. I met Ligeti, and he heard my music in a concert of the students' works, and as a result of that, later on I went to study with Ligeti. But my serious study was all post-Cambridge really. So I've had 2 years with Nadia Boulanger in Paris and a year in between with Ligeti in Hamburg. So I had a 3 years kind of postgraduate study. I wasn't doing it for a degree, I was just doing it to learn to compose better, and with Boulanger to learn to be a better musician altogether.
Yes, it's extraordinary. Nadia Boulanger was such a force, wasn't she?
Yes, I always say my biggest break in life was not playing to her when I was about 14 or 15. She was supposed to come to the Royal Academy of Music one Saturday, and I was supposed to play Bach Prelude and Fugue in E major Book 2 to her, And I can say this in hindsight, fortunately she was sick and didn't come. I've since heard her many times teach that piece, and she would have completely destroyed me the way I played it at that age. But she did come the next year, and I was asked to play one of my compositions to her. And so I met her then and played a piece to her. She was extremely nice, and we had a long chat. And rather bizarrely, she said, "Oh, you must go to university and study, and then come and study with me afterwards." Well, she was already a very old lady and looked like she wouldn't live too many years, but that's exactly what happened. I went to university, and then I got a French government scholarship and wrote to her, and she said, "Yes, come the first Wednesday in October for your first lesson." And that was it. And I had 2 years with her, and she was phenomenal. She was kind of greater than all the legends about her, and she made you work very, very hard. If you want to really read about her, there's Philip Glass, who was with her, I suppose, about 10 years before me. His book, which I've got here somewhere, Words Without Music, it's on my shelf somewhere. There's a whole chapter on studying with Mademoiselle, and he really captures what studying with her was like. It's a very, very good chapter. Right. If you worked hard for her, which meant 24/7 essentially from the moment you came out of a lesson preparing for the next lesson, then she could be wonderful. She could be very tough. And she just told you the truth, really. And some people couldn't take that. Yeah. But I knew, although I'd had a really kind of good education, I knew I was terribly lacking in my basic musical foundations. And after a few weeks of showing my compositions to her, she said, "Well, really, you are a composer. I want to see your music when you write it, but you are, as a musician, you are unprepared. And what I really want to do is prepare you as a musician." Well, I didn't mind hearing that, because I knew in my heart of hearts that I needed a much more rigorous training than I had got. And so we went back. It sounds boring, but it wasn't. We went to the beginnings of harmony and counterpoint and musical analysis. But with her, she was like a guru. It was opening up a whole world and getting new ears, hearing music in a new way. And then I would take my compositions to her as well when I'd done them. But so this was wonderful. So I was with her for a year. And then I got a scholarship to go to Germany, to Ligeti, who I'd met back in '73. And Boulanger had written me a wonderful reference to get me this scholarship, and then was very cross that I was leaving. So I said, "But Mademoiselle, you wrote this reference." She said, "I have nothing against Ligeti. I'm sure he's wonderful. He says, I've got a lot more to teach you. That I don't feel we've really begun in 1 year." And so after my year with Ligeti, I went back to her for a second year. So I had a kind of sandwich. Which was, it felt wonderful at the time, but in retrospect was just incredible,
Yeah.
And particularly meeting all these people in Paris. And when I was with her, Ligeti was actually coming to Paris quite a lot for concerts, so I would still see him. And when I was studying with him in Hamburg, I would come back to London via Paris and still see her for the odd lesson. So this was a real treat.
Yes, how fantastic.
Yeah.
What an amazing experience.
Yeah, that was tremendous.
Yes.
And I loved living in Paris, which was...
Well, yes, there's always that, of course,
yes.
Let's talk a little bit about then your education, your approach to education and to music for children and, everybody else.
Yes. I don't really have a separate approach to it at all. I just get up and make music. So the day I came back from studying with Boulanger, I got this, literally the afternoon I got back, I got a phone call from the Menuhin School asking me if I'd go and do some teaching there. Now, Boulanger had been very connected to Menuhin, and in fact she had been instrumental in sorting out the music curriculum when the school started in '63. And so I can't believe that she didn't have something to do with it along the way. And I know Robert Levin, the great American pianist who became head of academic music at Curtis when he left Boulanger, that she had also kind of behind the scenes told Curtis that they ought to take this young man on. He's now just retired as professor at Harvard or whatever. So I started teaching immediately at the Menuhin School, and I was there for 3 years in the late 70s, teaching music theory, composition and music theory. It was a very small school in those days, there were only 36 or 38 students. And once working with incredibly talented young people, so it's not like teaching in people who don't want to learn music, these are people who want to learn. And so I was just teaching the things I'd learned from Boulanger and just using the approach and learning on the job, really. And my word, that those students kept you on your toes, because they would ask really insightful questions and be very cheeky and tricky, but you really had to, think about what you were doing. So I suppose I developed my teaching then. There was a wonderful headmaster called Peter Renshaw, who then went on to run a department at Guildhall, who's a real philosopher of education, and Peter Norris, who was running most of the musical life of the school, and they were kind of my two mentors. They were chalk and cheese as personalities, but they created a very, very stimulating environment where we discussed education and we discussed the curriculum and what you do with these specifically talented children. So it developed then. Then I got a chance to go and study computer music in California for 2 years. So I left the Menuhin School and went to Stanford. And when I came back, I was commissioned to write a piece, nonet, for the school, Menuhin School, and then I went back to do a bit of part-time teaching. Then I left again because I was too busy, and then I went back as director of music. So I've known the Menuhin School. I was teaching there on and off for about 40 years. So I became very interested, involved in how you educate really talented young people and what skills they need. And as director of music, I had a phenomenal staff of really great teachers, and so I learned from them. My job was really to facilitate. Sitting in on a violin lesson with one of the great violin teachers, one would learn so much. But always encouraging new music to be part of what they do alongside all the standard repertoire and creativity. And Menuhin himself was very keen. He commissioned lots of new music, performed lots of new music. I think he liked the idea of having a composer as director of music of the school, rather. In the past, before me, it had always been an instrumentalist, either a violinist or a pianist, and so I think he thought it would be rather interesting to have a composer at the helm.
Yes. I mean, those are some huge names, aren't they? And to have spent time at Stanford as well.
Yes. John Channing, who was the professor at Stanford, who's in his 80s and still extremely active, was also a great man to work with. So wow. I was very, very lucky. And I got to know Yehudi quite well, a little bit at the beginning when I was a young teacher. And the nonet that they commissioned for me in the mid-80s, we then toured around Schleswig-Holstein with Menuhin and the Menuhin School Orchestra, so I spent quite a lot of time on tour with him then. And then, of course, when I became director of music, he and I spent a lot of time together. This was right at the end of his life, but he was still very involved in the school in that last year particularly. And we would talk a lot about music education. And he had obviously talked a lot about it with Boulanger going back decades, from when he was a young man and she was already a teacher.
Yes.
So it was this link with the past of approach to teaching.
Yes, and it's amazing, isn't it, that he chose to set up that school and found it and filled a need for that kind of musical education.
Yes, I mean in the post-war period, I think string teaching in the UK was not very good. And so partially, I think he formed the school to try and raise the standard of string teaching, which he was very successful in doing. He brought in lots of teachers, and then they went on to teach at the music colleges, and at least until Brexit, London has been a real centre for people from all over Europe to come and study string playing particularly. And piano, which is what the Menuhin School's about. And then secondly, if you read his autobiography, he paints this idyllic childhood that he had, but he only ever spent half a day at school in his life, and then he was educated at home with this very fierce mother. And talking to Yalta, his youngest sister, when she was an old lady, she considered their upbringing far from idyllic. And I think it must have been quite lonely for the three of them. And so I think he wanted an environment where young people who all felt this passion for classical music could have be in a community where other people felt about it. And he also believed profoundly that your first teachers are the most important ones. And if you get a good teacher when you're 15 or 16 as a string player, this is much too late.
Right. Yeah.
He thought 8 was too late, really.
Right.
But if you're having a boarding school, you can't really go much younger than that. But he thought that if you have potential to become a really good performer, you needed the best teachers at a very early age.
Yes.
And then I suppose the other reason to have the school is so that when these children go through their teenage years and their adolescence, they don't get exploited. They're not on the stage when they're going on the platform, on the concert platform, when they're going through difficult times, because psychologically that's very difficult. And a lot of these prodigies, so-called prodigies, burn out.
Oh yes.
So the school, to a certain extent, was there to pace their development. So these were the kind of reasons he founded it, and they're still really at the heart of what the school's about.
Yes, yeah, indeed. And your composing has obviously been such an important part of your life.
Yes.
And you've created some remarkable pieces of music. So
yeah, I write. Generally, it's performers who commission pieces for me. So I'm usually, not always, but I'm usually writing for people I know who want to play my music. And so that ranges right across the board. I've done a lot of choral music because I've done a lot of choir conducting, and I've done a lot of work for children in general because I've worked with young people. But I don't think I ever make any compromises when I'm writing for young people, and either when I'm writing for them or when they're performing, one expects the highest, them to be as excellent as they can be. So for me, it's all about the quality of the music making, and then writing much more what you would call traditional concert music for my friends who are performers wherever. So it's a variety of stuff. And even when I was more than full-time on at the Menuhin School as director of music, I would always try and be composing every year 2 or 3 pieces and keep the music going in the holidays and whenever. And you just learn to compose whenever you have a moment, really.
Yes.
So
how have you? I mean, obviously you went to Stanford.
Yes.
How has your music composition practice changed? I mean, do you still handwrite everything, or do you use technology?
Well, a bit of both. I mean, as you can see, we're now in my studio. I will try scribble on manuscript paper at the piano, or possibly not at the piano, or I'll sketch at my desk, and then it will go onto the computer in Sibelius, which is what I tend to use at the moment. But I don't use it for listening to the sound. I mean, I'm that generation where I can look at a score and I can hear what's going on. So I only use it for the kind of the publishing. But of course, if you're writing a big piece, it'll print out all the parts, and it's much quicker. So I go and I will also sketch on Sibelius and then print it out and then scribble on what I've done. So it's a complete hybrid system. And mostly I'm writing for concert instruments, so I'm not writing electronic music. I mean, I learnt a lot from doing computer music at Stanford, and it was very, very stimulating. And in those days, in 1980, when I arrived there, you needed an enormous room about this size with a computer, full of a computer, in order to make the kind of music we made on computers. And now a little Apple Mac will be much more powerful than that big room was in 1980. So the technology's moved on incredibly. Yes. And a lot of my students are doing work with electronic music, so I've got the background to help them with what they're doing there.
Right. Yeah. And that's interesting, isn't it? I think that's the best way, that hybrid way you're describing is actually the best way of using technology, because it's just one of the tools that you use. Just
well, I'm that generation who were old enough to have learnt the old way, as it were, but also young enough to be able to embrace the technology. Students who are coming up now have generally only composed on computers, and in fact at Guildhall where I work, we encourage them to go back to pencil and paper as well, because you think about music in a different way when you do it, and to use both. It's not to do one or the other, but just to have more tools available when you're working.
Yeah. Conducting. So you've talked a lot about choirs and things.
Yes. So when I was at university, one of the great advantages of Cambridge is that the enormous number of people who play instruments there who are studying other subjects. So I had an orchestra for 2 years that I conducted every week, and I kind of cut my teeth on that. And then when I was at my first spell in the Menuhin School, I was asked to conduct a male voice choir, and I had a time conducting the Weybridge Male Voice Choir, who I cut my teeth on as well, so to speak. And then I've always worked with choirs. I was director of music of the Zemel Choir, which is London's Jewish choir, for 10 years in the 80s, which was quite wonderful. I got to get to know a whole repertoire which I didn't really know, which is a very rich and exciting repertoire. And Zemel is essentially a community choir. Mostly Jewish people, but not entirely Jewish people. Mostly Jewish music, but also some secular music. And we did some very exciting things. We performed in York Minster and Westminster Abbey, and we toured America and toured Israel, toured Europe. So that was really good. And I enjoy working with amateurs. I find that stimulating. And with an amateur choir, each individual might not have the confidence or the ability to sing as a soloist, but once you put them together, you can actually produce something which is really can be very high quality. And so that was always very rewarding. And then at the Menuhin School, I was conducting the orchestra, so I did a lot of conducting in that period.
Yeah.
And now I'm just reworking a piece I wrote a long time ago for a children's cantata for sort of 10, 11, 12-year-olds to sing, which will be with string orchestra, piano and percussion, and I'll be conducting performances next autumn of that. So I'm just reorchestrating that at the moment.
Wow, that's fantastic. We met originally through Michael Shapiro. So
yes.
how are you connected to
so
Michael?
I met Michael in Siena in the second year. So I went to Siena for 2 summers, 73 and 74, and Michael was there in 74. And we're both MJS. I'm Malcolm John Singer, and he's Michael Jeffrey Shapiro. And we both come from, kind of middle-class Jewish backgrounds, me in London, him in New York, and we immediately became friends. Our music is very different, but he'd been at Juilliard. He'd also worked with Malcolm Arnold, a British composer. So we had lots of kind of connections and interests in common. So we stayed very good friends. He became an opera repetiteur in Zurich at one point. I remember going to spend time out in Zurich with him, and just down the years we've stayed in contact, which is a long time now. And I saw him just a few years ago when I was in New York. We keep in touch now regularly on email and Zoom and what have you. And when he's performing in London, in England, we meet up. So we have that connection going a long way back. And he, of course, went off into a career as a lawyer and then went back into music, whereas I've never was going to do anything else but spend my life making music.
Yes, and he's a real Anglophile, isn't he? I mean, there's his grandfather was sort of in London and
yes, and he's come over a lot to work with orchestras in the UK. So I see him. Then he's been to hear my Menuhin School Orchestra when I was working with them. So we're in constant contact.
Yeah. So how was your lockdown?
Well, I think one would say very privileged.
Right.
I mean, I got COVID in the summer, presumably Delta, but it was pretty mild because I'd already had 2 vaccinations. And I have this lovely studio and I have a garden, so I'm very lucky. So I found it creatively rather rewarding, actually. So the first thing I did was to write a piano suite called Lockdown Suite. One of my ex-pupils actually had put out a challenge that he was going to write a piano invention like Bach, 2-part invention every day at the beginning of lockdown. So I started writing, not 2-part inventions, but writing a piece a day. But some of them took a little bit longer and spread out, and ended up producing a lockdown suite, which was performed in a lockdown concert. And in fact, I'm just off to Amsterdam because I'm on the jury of a piano competition next week, and the lockdown suite is being played, having its first live performance, hopefully in Amsterdam, because Amsterdam's in a bit of a state at the moment. But I think we are allowed to have concerts with a small audience, and there's a concert of the jury members, most of whom are pianists, but I'm there as a composer on the jury, so one of the pianists is playing my lockdown suite.
Wow.
I've been teaching a lot online, which works very well for teaching composition. Teaching instruments online is not such a easy task, but for composition it works pretty well. You can share the screen and the students are really focused because we're looking at things together. Well, my granddaughter was born on Christmas Day 2020, so that Christmas that everyone was having a really miserable lockdown, I took my daughter into hospital on Christmas Eve, collected her on Christmas Day, and we had a new baby.
Wonderful.
So I really can't complain about lockdown. We're now back to teaching face-to-face at Guildhall, which is better for the students. And just kind of looking back at what we were talking about before, in those amazing student years I had, although of course I got an enormous amount from these phenomenal musical teachers and performers and composers, but I got a lot from my peer group. the other students.
Yes.
And the current students, and it's, that means sitting up all night talking about philosophy and music and drinking wine or beer or whatever. And I have friendships all over the world now, not just like Michael Shapiro and in New York, but all over the world who were studying with me in these various places, who I'm still really close to. And I'm just worried about the current generation of undergraduates who missed out on at least 18 months of that kind of mixing with their peer group. So their work hasn't suffered in the short term, but they haven't made those kind of connections we made, which really bond musicians worldwide.
Absolutely, and I think anybody at either at the early part of their degree or even at the end of their degree, particularly, I think that my son, in fact, was he should have graduated in sort of June 2020, and actually graduated in November because they gave them all an extension and all the rest of it. But the end of his, it was a bit flat.
Yes, of course.
He graduated and then it was like, you can't go and get a job, so you go and work in a...
Well, most of my students I'd been working with pre-lockdown, but I have acquired some new students, and to start the relationship on lockdown is really tough for everyone.
Yes, exactly.
Anyway, we are all face to face at the moment, and that's not too bad. But I do think they've missed out, and for me, those connections, particularly through lockdown, where I'm talking to friends in San Francisco and all over the world, making our connections again, which is great.
Yes.
So that's so as I say, I can't really complain about lockdown. I've had lots of work to do throughout it. A lot of my colleagues who are only performers, of course, they lost their income completely, and they live for being on the stage, and not being on the stage is just been appalling for them.
Yes.
And they found it, even the best of them who've been practicing all the time, I mean, most famous people, found themselves a bit rusty getting back in front of audiences all the time. So it's quite tricky.
Yes, I think it's not the same that sort of, preparing for a performance. You prepare the music for a performance in a very different way to preparing for you're just ordinarily practicing or preparing for recording and things. And I think that's been lost for a lot of people.
I mean, just before lockdown, the autumn before, I had one of my other big children's cantatas was done with 300 children performing and about 700 people packed into St Mary's Horsham in West Sussex, and the buzz of the event,
yes,
and the standard it raises in the performers is just incredible. Well, we're never going to do that again. In fact, the new project I'm doing for next autumn, we're going to have to do lots more performances with smaller audiences, and it'll be wonderful, and we'll have lots more children involved because there'll be different children in different performances. Right. But the buzz of this big event in must have been 2019 was something that you feed off as a composer and as a performer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
I'm sure there are lots of other things that I could have asked you, and I keep looking at all these books behind you and going, oh yeah, there's that. Oh yeah, there's that. And it's that kind of...
Well, as I said to you at the beginning, my tastes are very Catholic in music, and my students are interested in many different types of music that I kind of have to embrace it all in any case.
Yeah.
So I'll have some who want to discuss, esoteric German contemporary music, and others who are obsessed with Stephen Sondheim, and I enjoy both, and I enjoy dealing with both. Hence all these books.
I like the fact that your Philip Glass is next to medieval music, and that's almost, there's an irony, isn't there, of that, which is lovely.
Yeah.
That's where the interview officially finished, but then Malcolm and I started going through some of his music tracks on his desktop. I opened this episode of the podcast with Mitim, and you can hear Malcolm talk about that now.
The flute is a solo flute piece. That's a very early piece of mine. He's a Russian flautist. I tell you, you might like this.
That's beautiful.
He's very, very good. I wrote this while I was studying with Boulanger.
Really?
Yeah, this is 1974, 75.
I've been picking up my flute again.
All right.
And I think I'm going to have a look at it.
Okay. It began life as incidental music for Measure, for a play, a student production in Cambridge, and I wrote lots of short sections, and I put it together into a piece. And it was written for someone called Tim, so it became Mid Tim with Tim.
Oh.
This is a piece that I wrote at Yehudi's centenary, and this is the Menuhin School pupils playing it. So you might like that. It's Chagall's violin. So this was commissioned by the Menuhin family for his centenary. This is kind of my more serious music with young people playing. This girl's now a jazz singer.
Really?
Teaching jazz singing at this girl's an early music specialist. So I wrote it especially for my students.
Right. Did you have in mind the specific students on the specific parts, or was it just a sort of...
I had on mind the one playing the solo.
Yeah.
Who was a young... She's
amazing.
Yes, she was only 14 then. But the others, no, these were kind of the more senior ones. But I had the idea of one in the middle with this kind of halo around them.
Yes.
And I often begin with a kind of a choreography in mind before I even start on the music.
That's interesting, because actually visually that's quite an interesting... For a start, they're standing in that semicircle around her.
Yeah, and she's playing with no music.
Yes. I suspect that Malcolm and I could have gone on for hours with playing clips of his music and talking about the composition process. It was absolutely fascinating, and I'm so grateful to Malcolm for giving me his time so generously. It was so difficult to choose one piece of music to begin and another to end this podcast, but what you're listening to now is Malcolm Singer's Grammar of Hope. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this, my 100th episode of Harmonious World. I really can't believe it's got this far. I'm also really grateful to Michael Shapiro for introducing me to Malcolm, and he's actually introduced me to another couple of people who are going to make for some very, very interesting interviews and episodes of Harmonious World. So please do rate and review wherever you get this podcast. I'm fascinated to read my reviews, so thank you for those. Do connect with me on social media. On the show notes you can see how to connect with Malcolm to find out more about his compositions. As ever, please do share what you are good at to make this world a more harmonious place. We definitely need more harmony in our world. Thank you for joining me once more for Harmonious World. Thank you for listening to the latest episode of Harmonious World. My name is Hilary Seabrook, and it's a great delight to bring this series of discussions with musicians and composers and writers and all sorts of people to you. Obviously, there's no point in having a podcast if people aren't listening, and I'm very grateful to my listeners for doing so. Thanks also to Joe English for composing and performing this new theme tune. So wherever you get your podcast, you can leave a review. You can share this with your friends and family, either as a link or on social media and that sort of thing. I'd be really grateful for that. Don't forget that you can subscribe now. There's a link wherever you get your podcasts. So have a great week, and please remember why I started this, which is just to try and make the world a little more harmonious. Thanks for listening to Harmonious World.